We are imperial. We are imperial and we are in decline. Part of this is because of our own complicity in bringing about that decline, bad decisions, bad foreign policy, strategically inept maneuvers in the world. And part of it, and we can argue, my students and I do, over what portion each shares, but part of it is the rise of others' power. Something that we strategically and otherwise planned for and helped post-World War II. We essentially told the Japanese, for example, you develop an export economy, we'll buy your products and we'll raise you out of the ashes which we created. And believe me, my Japanese colleagues who look back on Hiroshima and Nagasaki understand the nature of those ashes. That memory's dying, and that in itself is a political change element in the world, just as it's dying in Europe. Powell looked at me one day, Colin Powell looked at me and he said, you know, Larry, very soon we will not have a Mitterrand, a John Major, a Maggie Thatcher, a Helmut Kohl, or anybody who remembers the war. And that is going to change the complexion of Europe and the relationship with the United States. And he was absolutely right. We have been complicit in the others' rise in a positive way because we have worked with them. We have brought them in to the capitalist world, the world of entrepreneurism and market dynamics and so forth. From Japan to Germany to France to England and so forth, we've helped them. We've either revived them or taught them new skills. In the case of Japan, we have provided them the most important ingredient in the world if you're a nation, and that's national security. We have virtually provided it to them for half a century. Our nuclear umbrella and our willingness to spend until we're physically bankrupt to a certain extent has helped Japan for half a century. And I tell my Japanese colleagues that all the time, especially when they start telling me they're opposed to what Prime Minister Abe is doing today, trying to grow Japan up a little bit and shoulder a little more responsibility in this regard. Because we have provided the good, the public good of national security to a lot of people in the world. And I don't eliminate, if you'll allow me, Canada from that proposition. The West and Japan have had to spend much less on defense because the United States of America, empire that it is, was willing to spend a hell of a lot more. In fiscal year 2013, we spent $1.2 trillion, and I can demonstrate it to you account by account on national security. Think about that for a minute. $1.2 trillion. We spent $600 billion on that five-sided puzzle palace called the Pentagon. We spent another $100 billion plus, it's classified, on our intelligence, 17 intelligence entities, yes, 17. We spent around 40 to 50 billion on what's called Homeland Security plus. We spent enormous amounts on nuclear weapons in the Department of Energy, enormous amounts which are growing every minute of every day on the Veterans Administration. And we spent a pittance on the last part, I'll denominate here, the 150 account at the State Department diplomacy. $1.2 trillion, with the predominant amount of that going, I would say, to hard power, or the instruments of hard power. That's empire. That's imperial state.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're doing super great. From wherever you're watching us from, I'm your host and presenter, Agent Stories. Well, I'm hoping that you are doing great. Now, Professor Lawrence Wilkerson is a former U.S. Army Colonel-in-Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he delivers a scathing and insightful critique of American empire in his lecture. It's called The Travails of Empire. And now, in his talk, he asserts that the United States is not declining merely due to global shifts or the rise of rival powers, but because of decisions made within its political, military, and economic system. Now, Wilkerson's core thesis is that empires do not die suddenly. First, They decay from within. Now, in America's case, its over-reliance on military might, disregard for domestic well-being, and the corruption of its democratic institutions all serves as evidence of imperial overstretch and internal erosion. Normally, when we talk about the fall of empires, the perfect example that I've always been used is, like we are saying today, in the perfect day is the Americans. All the process that you see me talking, and we've seen scholars, and I've tried to share podcasts of scholars who try to talk about these issues. So I feel like it's important for us to really have a discussion in regards to this, because every professor, every lawyer, every scholar that comes, they have their own theory. But there is one thing that stands about all things and passes across all of them, is that the fall of America is manufactured fall. It is manufactured within the American system. It means that the elites are the ones who are driving the economy, that are driving all this military imperialism. They are driving it so that it can decline. The decline of America is from within. The fall of America is from within. It doesn't entirely have to do with anything to do with Japan, or it has nothing to do with something that happens in China. Of course, they're affected, but try to look at it introspectively. The fall of America is manufactured within the United States. So buckle up for this video and really let me know what you think about these issues, because I feel like, man, it's important for us to always have a discussion in regards to this. As you know, I'm your host and presenter, Eugene Stories. And for those who are watching us for the first time, I'll most definitely ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, and really get to see what you can offer you. For those who are supporting us through the Cash App, those who are sending us super thanks, I'm really grateful for the support, for you making this channel to be part of its growth. I'm on my way to 150k subscribers. I'm asking and pleading with you, if you're always watching my videos and you're not subscribing to the channel, I'm asking you to please subscribe to my channel. I'm asking. So let's watch the video. I'll be back, and then I'll be sharing my thoughts at the end of it all.
And our presidents, since the end of the Cold War, have found it a whole lot easier to make what I call fateful decisions. And my students and I define fateful decisions as those decisions a president makes to send young men and young women to die for state purposes, or, and we forget this often, especially in my country, to kill other people for state purposes, or to risk your life in the process. And we look at it from two perspectives. We look at it from the perspective of war, what we used to call war. We call it conflict, hostilities, or some other euphemism today. Or covert operations, which are cheaper, but nonetheless for the people executing them just as much in harm's way. Ronald Reagan, for example, in 8 years of the presidency, conducted 58 covert operations, some of which we don't even know the details of today. By the time the American people have the details from the moratorium on classification being lifted, they won't care. It was 25 years before we knew of the complicity of the United States in the overthrow of the first democratically elected prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. Yes, we overthrew him. And then next year we overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala. And I could go on and on. So that's the covert side of the use of this imperial power. Do you think we didn't have anything to do with the attempt to overthrow Hugo Chavez in Venezuela? We certainly did. I was there. Do you think we didn't have something to do with the recent turmoil in Kiev? You bet we did. Do you think we didn't have something to do with the turmoil that Russia finally reacted to in Georgia, and Israel too? We certainly did. Do you think we didn't have anything to do with the turmoil in Damascus? We certainly did. We have not stopped conducting those 58 covert operations in 8 years just because we changed presidents, I'll guarantee you. So one might ask the question, what will the empire reveal in 10 or 12 years, or 15 or 25 years? What will you learn about it in that regard? So in every meaningful way, we are an empire. If there's a unique part of it, I think, and my students talk about this a lot too. They wrestle with this question. It is that, as Colin Powell used to say, when we fight a war and we kill other people and we take their territory and we establish ourselves in their terrain, we don't ask for anything afterwards but enough land to bury our dead. That's very untraditional. So if you look at those beautiful cemeteries opposite the Normandy landing beaches in France or elsewhere in Europe, you understand what we ask for: a plot of ground for our people to lie in who sacrificed their lives. Increasingly, however, that sacrifice is even being questioned by the modern volunteer military, better titled the all-recruited military, $8 billion last year to recruit it. Increasingly, even they are asking questions about the imperialism and what it means and where they might lie in their grave should they be killed. I keep a portrait of a young William & Mary graduate in the back of my seminar room, 22 years old, brilliant young man, went to Afghanistan and died there. And I constantly remind my students, and they hardly look me in the eye when I do this, that that is the ultimate price of your president's fateful decisions. Never whitewash it, understand. And they know in their heart of hearts that most of the people who are in these foreign legions, in the empire's military, would be where they were if they were intellectually and more often financially capable of being there. But they're not. And so they're in the empire's military. So we have been complicit in this decline. It's not just natural that others' power is rising. It is also a fact of our having been strategically inept on a number of occasions. The one I'm most familiar with is the one I spent 12 years of my career dealing with in the military, and then had to deal with as a special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, then Colin Powell, and then later had to deal with again as his Chief of Staff of the State Department, and that's Southwest Asia, the Middle East, and Iraq in particular. What did we do for all that time frame? And this is just to show you an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about our complicity in our decline. We, through realpolitik that you may agree with and disagree with, we can talk about that all day long, we maintained a balance of power in the Persian Gulf. Ever since FDR and the King of Saudi Arabia sat down and talked, we have been complicit in that balance of power. We in the United States, and we generally in the West, have bought that deal. So we could have petroleum at a price that was affordable and not too disruptive in our economy. Indeed, fed and grew our economies. What did we do to maintain that balance of power? Well, first, we overthrew Mossadegh for the British, essentially, but the British probably would have had a lot of trouble accepting the Marshall Plan and growing themselves out of World War II's defeat, and we might say World War I's defeat too. This was the death knell for the British Empire, after all. If we hadn't made sure that cheap oil in Iran kept coming to London. Some have estimated, people much smarter than I in this affair, that 40% of the British government's hard currency came from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. So now you know why they didn't want to give it up. Harry Truman told them, go to hell. There will be no U.S. complicity in the overthrow of Mossadegh. Dwight Eisenhower came in, a little wiser man, a little more astute, and a little more attuned to the necessities of the Cold War. And he said, okay, let's do it. He was also an Anglophile. He loved the British. He should have been. He was there a long time. So, we put the Shah in place, and for 26 years, he maintained for us the balance of power in the Persian Gulf. Protected our interests there. We didn't have to do too much. Whoa, the Iranians got tired of that. And in '79, as you well know, they overthrew that Shah. There's a real picture of ineptitude on the part of the United States. We didn't even predict it. And all of a sudden we were out. Well, how do we reestablish the balance of power? Let's take Saddam Hussein's side, let's take Iraq's side, let's balance the Arabs and the Persians. This is where I come on the scene. That's what I helped to orchestrate. As long as Tehran and Baghdad were opposed to one another, viscerally so in many respects, the balance was maintained. What do we do in 1991 when Saddam Hussein, well, let's go back a little bit to the bloodiest war in that region, the Iran-Iraq War, and the United States finally taking Iraq's side in that war. As you well know, we kind of played both ends against the middle in the beginning. Ronald Reagan tried to sell arms to the Iranian in order to get hostages back, diverted the money to the Contras in Nicaragua, and so forth and so on. So we played both sides of the game, but when it became apparent that Iran might win that war and thus disrupt the balance of power we'd so painstakingly maintained to that point, we took Iraq's side. And it wound up in Vincennes, our high-tech cruiser in the Gulf, actually shooting down an Iranian Airbus by mistake and killing 290 innocent Iranians. And the Ayatollah even said, we think from the records we've gotten from Iran, something like, I drank the hemlock and I quit. He agreed to end the war. He agreed to do what the UN wanted him to do and cease fire. And the reason was because he knew he couldn't defeat the United States. He could defeat Iraq maybe, but not the United States. So the balance was restored. Argue with the way we did it. I once told my admiral when we reflagged Kuwaiti tankers in Operation Earnest Will in the Gulf, my admiral was talking on the phone, oddly enough, to Colin Powell, Ronald Reagan's national security advisor at the time. I once told my admiral, this is bad, we shouldn't do this. I don't care if the Russians are coming to the Gulf to do it, let them do it. They'll get so embroiled, it'll bring down their empire. And let's wait until there's only one Persian left and one Iraqi, and let's issue them dueling pistols. I mean, that's how cold-hearted I was about it. I was pure strategist. No, we had to take their side and so forth. Well, it worked until Saddam Hussein decided he'd go into Kuwait, and then we had to mount 500,000 men and women, build a coalition, and go over there and kick him out of Kuwait because we were really afraid he was going to turn right and go to Ras Tanura at 6 million barrels per day production capacity and disrupt that oil flow majorly. But it worked. We didn't go to Baghdad. We just restored the balance. And Dick Cheney, then Secretary of Defense, was 100% behind that, as was everyone else in the H.W. Bush administration. So now we come, fast forward, I'm Chief of Staff of the State Department. My boss is still Colin Powell, and we do it all over again, and we remove Saddam Hussein. Are you beginning to see the colors of the strategic ineptitude? So what choice do we have? We have two, basically. Three, we could say, to hell with the balance of power, we're going home. Let's see what happens. Or we could have said, we'll stay. We'll be the balancer. We quickly determined, you say it took a decade, but we nonetheless, I think, determined over time that that was really dangerous. Remaining in the region in force for a long time on the ground was really dangerous. We might actually fuse a lot of very disparate elements into a major opposition to what? Us. And every U.S. Marine and soldier would have a big red bullseye on his back, and every terrorist in the world would flock there to shoot that bullseye. So we moved ourselves out. What's the choice then? Well, you either go back when it turns into chaos again, which it most assuredly has done, or you quickly try to craft a new balance. How would you do that? Well, you would have a rapprochement with Tehran. You would have closer relations with Tehran. You would bring Iran back into the balance because she's the only country in the region, by the way, that's stable, reasonably prosperous, and I know you'll argue with this probably, but fairly well led. And she has a lot of democratic tendencies. She's very theocratic, but she has a lot of democratic tendencies. We once accepted her for 26 years when she had our tyrant at her helm, but now we have problems. Well, I think this administration is working secretly along those lines. Maybe not as fast as I'd like to see them work, but they are working that way. Or the other alternative, again, is go back. Go back and drag as many allies as you can with you. I watched some of the video of your parliament debating, and I watched the vote count and so forth. I was kind of surprised that it was so close. I thought it would probably be overwhelmingly for entering the fray. That kind of caution, I think, and some of the speeches that were made in opposition, which I heard just snippets of, were pretty smart and deliberate, and I think vouchsafed some truths. What are we going to do now, though? What's the empire going to do now? So let's just leave that for a moment. Glad to answer questions about it, but let's leave that for a moment and go back to my main theme. What is the empire going to do now? With or without allies, with or without UN legitimacy or whatever. What are we going to do now? Well, let's examine a few things. What scares me the most about the empire that really has nothing to do with this except indirectly? The first thing that frightens me is the disequilibrium of wealth. I got a new soundbite for that today, and I got it from a Frenchman and an article he wrote. And it's not Thomas Piketty, although I'd recommend Piketty to you. Capital in the 21st Century is his book. 400 people in the United States have a wealth that equals Brazil's gross domestic product. The government is bankrupt, but 400 people have a wealth that equals Brazil's gross domestic product. 1/1000th of the United States, I'm not talking about the top 10%, not the top 1%, I'm talking about 1/1000th, owns 50% of the wealth of the United States. Throw income in there, throw the 10% in there, they own about 75%. That means the other 300 plus million get by on 25%, income or wealth. Wealth being capital, stocks, shares, and so forth, and income being, of course, income. Staggering. How do you run a democracy? How do you run the midterm elections when Mitch McConnell can spend $100 million in Kentucky and flood a very impoverished state with money so he can be reelected? How do you do that? How do you maintain a democracy when you have that kind of disequilibrium? Piketty will tell you, with a meticulous research of the tax records of France and the United States, essentially that. There are a lot of other points in his books that scare you to death. Like, for example, in the 21st century, he predicts we'll never exceed 3% growth. Not on the present economic profile. None of us will exceed 3% growth. Well, some of us may, but the aggregate will never be above 3%. Because we've hit it. We've hit it. We're finished in terms of the present economic model and growth. The old bugaboo, growth. The Chinese would be scared. If they've read Piketty, they're probably scrambling around the Central Party School now trying to figure out what to do. It's really frightening when you look at that aspect. But the aspect I want to highlight is what he found out about France and the United States, who have the most extensive tax records. If I'm not mistaken, and I recall correctly, France all the way back to 1789, the United States back to when we implemented the income tax around 1910, 1912. Guess what? Situation in the U.S. is 1929. Situation in France is 1789. Now maybe you understand a little bit of the problem that Hollande is confronting and France is confronting from an economic point of view. And a problem that we've masked and camouflaged with a vibrant stock market and a whole lot of return to prosperity of that top 1,000th, but not much for the rest. This is scary to me. You know, I've fought for my country, I've served my country, I understand a little bit, I think, about what I'm talking about, and it's very frightening. It's very frightening. The empire is in decline. The empire is in decline because of the rise of others' power, the BRIC nations, for example, India, China, Brazil, and so forth, but also because of its own ineptitude. And when that happens and the status quo and the preservation thereof becomes your principal goal in life, and you discard any innovation, any change, any mix of ingredients that you are not primus inter pares in, then you become your own worst enemy. And unfortunately, you drag a lot of good, self-respecting, decent, brave, patriotic themselves, competent allies with you. The latest example might be NATO. Are we going to go to war over the Ukraine? Well, they're not a NATO member. Not yet, anyway. We threatened to make them one. I'll tell you who is, though. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And a lot of the words that are coming out of Moscow right now look a lot like the words that came out of Moscow right before the fiat in Crimea. So is Putin serious about maybe protecting the Russian citizenry in those three countries, the Baltic states? And will he go as far as to use either covert operations or maybe more overt operations with real military involved? And what will we do in response? Well, I'll tell you what they'll tell me in Oklahoma City. Die for Riga? No chance. And people say, no, it can't happen, it can't happen. Go back and read about 1933, 1934, 1935, 1936, and so forth. People were saying the same thing then. People were saying the same thing then. We live in a dangerous world, and the empire is in decline. The empire that has provided public security for much of the West and Japan for 50 years is in decline. You can see signs of that if you look. You can see signs of that everywhere. You can also see signs of the strategic ineptitude and the bad decision making. It's almost a product of empire in decline. You become more and more desperate. You become more and more eager to preserve the status quo. You don't listen to people who argue contrary to your views. John Brennan and Jim Clapper, your intelligence chiefs, become the powerful gurus in your administration, and anything they tell you that makes you think that ISIS might be in Houston tomorrow makes you want to do things you would never have even calculated or contemplated doing 10 years before. Especially when you are a novice in the office. And we haven't had an expert in the office since Dwight Eisenhower. That's democracy. That's one of the weaknesses of democracy, especially a democracy that's constructed like ours, has a political process like ours, and has money flooding that process and determining more than anything else who holds the leadership positions. And you do away with all the inhibitions to war, and you transfer the war power, which is constitutionally in the legislature, to the executive. And that's exactly what we've done. That's what empires do. Empires don't have a Senate that debates war. Empires have a Caesar that goes to war. And that's what we've become. We have some good features still, of course. We have some good people still, of course. We have people who want to do something about what they see happening around them, physically and physically, morally, ethically, and in the form of realpolitik. They want to do something about it. They want better decision making. They want better action domestically and internationally. But so far, they have been unable to penetrate that status quo veneer that is woven now around the beltway in which I live, Washington, D.C. One of my Idaho friends with whom I trout fish in the Bitterroot Mountains said recently to me, a smart man, wealthy man, looked at me and he said, Washington can go to hell. We do not give a damn about Washington. And I encounter that attitude in a lot of places. Down in the Southwest, where they're going to dry up in the next decade, and they're going to have to change their entire lifestyle from Phoenix to the San Joaquin Valley, they're thinking finally about what they might do to adapt, because the water is leaving and it is not coming back. They're either going to burn up or dry up, or both simultaneously. So they're thinking they need to do something, and they're trying to figure out what to do, but they're not looking to Washington to do it. So if there's a potential domestic way to resurrect the republic, as it were, it's probably going to be contrary to everything anybody would believe in this day and age. It's going to be the revivification of the states. It's going to be the power in the states taking on some of these problems and dealing with them and saying to hell with Washington. That's a hell of a kettle of fish, isn't it, for an empire? There was a book written about 20 years ago called The 9 Nations of North America. Guess what? One of them takes a little bit of your country, too, to make it. You know, the potential's there. The potential's there. I've had serious conversations with Texans, South Carolinians, Alabamans, Mississippians, and Georgians about leaving the Union. Serious conversations. They reconsider when they look at the deficit they would occur economically immediately and understand that California and New York and revenue transfers is the only reason they're economically salvageable. So they better come up with something other than German BMW and Mercedes plants in order to, you know, economically be sound if they're going to leave. Now that's way out in the future, but it is a distinct possibility, particularly when we confront, and I'm going to end on this, the most enormous challenge which the empire and the rest of us confront. And that's the fact that the earth, whether we're human inducing it or it's just natural, the science is clear. The earth has given us 1 millennium of really good life. It's getting ready to change, and maybe dramatically. We may see portions of Florida gone, we'll see Bangladesh gone, we'll see all kinds of changes. I remember when the president of Palau came into Admiral Crow's office in 1984, and he was in the executive conference room and he looked at my admiral and he said, "Admiral Crow, I have a question for you." And the admiral said, "Mr. President, we're here to address your questions." And he said, "What are we going to do when my island's gone? Where are you going to move me and my people?" Well, that's happening today. You know, it wasn't so far-fetched. Many of those South Pacific islands are going to disappear. Parts of Florida, Texas coast are going to disappear. North Carolina has already put money against moving some very pristine marshlands 2.5 miles inside their present location. That's very expensive and very difficult, very complex operation. But they've made the commitment to do it because they know they're going away. The salt water is going to rise and move into them and ruin them. So they're going to move them back some. This is reality. I've had some scenarios briefed to me by competent climatologists that say there might not be enough arable land for any more than maybe 1 billion people in terms of food production by as early as 2065. People say, "Oh, that's way out there." My grandchildren will still be alive, probably. This is the challenge, probably, of the planet. And we're finally, 30 years late, waking up to it in Washington. Dems and Republicans, finally waking up to it. Got a bunch of evangelicals out there yearning for the rapture who don't care. They want it to come. They think it's, you know, simultaneous with the Antichrist and so forth. There's about 48 million of these crazies. That crisis could have a silver lining. That crisis could forge the kind of cooperation and consensus both nationally in my country and ultimately globally, certainly regionally amongst, let's say, the top 20 initially, and then it's got to include the whole globe, might forge that kind of cooperation and consensus to meet this challenge over a sustained period of time that will bring out the leadership, bring out the innovation, bring out the clear thinking, bring out the strategic thinkers, bring out all that's necessary to not only revive the ship of state in my country, but to help the human race meet this challenge. And I don't say that grandiosely, because it is a challenge to the human race. But so far, we don't know of any others out there. There might be, but so far, we're the only ones. So this could be a very propitious time. Chinese have a saying, "May you live in interesting times." We do. I'm not going to see it. I'm going to be dead. But I really care about my grandchildren and my children too, who might see the leading edge of this. And I want them to have at least as reasonable a prospect for a good life, a decent life, as I had. And the people who sacrificed for that, I'm beholden to. So that's why I think I'm a patriot. I'm not an abuser of empire or an abuser of my country. I really care about my country. People ask me why I'm still a Republican all the time. And I say, because I want the party of Lincoln back. Turn it loose. Get out of my party. Don't tell me to get out. That's why I stay there. And I hope we're having some progress in resurrecting at least an element of that party that'll have more sense over the next decade or two. So that's what I came to talk to you about. I'm finished talking now. I'd be glad to entertain your questions. And if I can entertain them on other subjects, specific subjects that are nonetheless a part of this tapestry, like ISIS, Syria, Ukraine, the Baltics, or whatever, I'd be glad to do so, whatever your interest is. And I would ask you, if you want to ask a question, there are microphones at the end of each aisle here. Just come to those microphones and ask away. I'm told we also have some people out there who are listening through other mechanisms, and they may have some questions on the screen here, so if there's one there, I'll try to go to it too. Yes, you had a question? Or oh, okay, I thought you were the first one. Come on, you know, I've said some provocative things. I know you're out there cogitating over them. Who is this dude? Please ask me.
You're like priming the pump, if I may, so Fred can succeed.
Sure.
When we were having dinner beforehand, I was asking you about your perspective on the rationale for the new military intervention in Iraq that Canada is now going to be a part of, and whether the basis for it was more thoughtful, perhaps, than it was. You talked about the ineptitudes of the past, and you had some thoughts about that, about whether there's more careful thinking now, more ideas about the long-term strategic interest and the possible exit strategy. Can you comment on that?
Surely. Everybody heard that? No? In essence, he's asking, are the president and his advisors in what they're doing against ISIL in Iraq and Syria right now acting more wisely than what I've kind of depicted in the past? My answer would be yes, but I'd qualify that answer. I don't know where they're going. I don't know to what strategic purpose they're doing what they're doing. If they're doing it essentially to reintroduce U.S. and whatever else will go, ground forces in the region, if that's their ultimate goal, convince the American people who now are very much against that. Polls show they're okay with the bombing, but they're not okay with recommitment of ground forces. If they're going to work the American people into the fervor that they'd need to work them into, largely through the politics of fear, and watch that very closely, you know, this Khorasan group, this Al-Qaeda group plotting to attack the United States, I went straight to my intelligence contacts, the ones I respect and trust, both active and retired, and you never retire from the intelligence community. And I said, any truth? You notice the president hadn't mentioned them again? This was really good for getting the American people to push those polls up for action. But the Khorasan group, no one can tell me who they are or what they are, other than, oh, it's about 50 Al-Qaeda that Zawahiri sent down there to plan to attack the United States. Well, I would suspect that Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda's leader now, Ayman al-Zawahiri, probably sent them down there to make sure the Islamic State was not doing things that he didn't want them to do, or try to control some of the elements in the Islamic State that are not terrorist. Not terrorist. What do I mean by that? Do you really think that terrorists are out there manning main battle tanks? Something that takes the United States Army a year to train someone to do? Manning the late model Soviet main battle tanks and pumping rounds into Kobani? That's Sunnis from Iraq. That's the same Sunnis that David Petraeus awakened in 2007 and convinced them to attack the Al-Qaeda elements in Iraq, who incidentally predominantly had come from other places we'd disturbed, like Libya, Cyrenaica, the greatest producer of recruits for Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and got them, along with the Sunnis whom we had essentially disbanded the military of and essentially sent out into the deserts to attack us mercilessly, to agree to stop that, get rid of al-Qaeda, and come join in a government in Baghdad. And they did. And what did Maliki do, Nouri al-Maliki, our ruler in Baghdad? Well, he put them in prison, he murdered them, and he kicked them out of all political power. So what do you think they're doing now? ISIS forces didn't take Mosul. They were on the surface of it. The Sunnis did. Guess who's paying for that too? Saudi Arabia. Ooh, Joe Biden spoke the truth? You bet he did. And he had to apologize for it, of course. I hope that was orchestrated. I hope the president said, why don't you go out and tell the truth, Vice President, and then we'll reprimand you, but we'll get it out there. People start thinking about it, including the people in Riyadh. Because we know what they're doing. Powell used to describe the Saudis this way. There's a horse race. There's 3 horses pulling out ahead. Saudis pack all their money on those 3 horses. Watch the race, watch the race, watch the race. One horse is pulling out in the lead, in the lead, in the lead. Put all their money on that horse. That's Saudi strategy. That's what they do. So they're backing the very people they're now helping us bomb. Although I have to tell you, I haven't seen a single fighter jet or fighter bomber with a Saudi decal on the side of it. That's how complex this situation is. Extremely complex. So the answer to your question is yes, but to what purpose? I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen it revealed.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for being here. Are there any consequences to the U.S. continuously racking up debt? Like, how do you see that playing out?
That's an excellent question, and it's my greatest fear. It's my greatest fear. It's like I tell my students, when you leave here, you'll owe $100,000. Do you think you're ahead? Yes, there are dire consequences. If you've listened to some of the people who've gone public lately, one of them viral on the internet, I'm not sure how much to believe him though. He's one of the principal advisors to what the CIA calls its Futures Project, where it does a report for 2025, 2030 and so forth that looks out to the future. And that's not just the CIA. Now under the DNI, it's the National Intelligence Council, which is really the whole intelligence community feeding into that, into the NIC. He says that what he sees around the world, and he's told the intelligence community this, and they're now using their very sophisticated assets to measure this, and I know they're sophisticated. I've used them with them against North Korea principally, to see if what he's saying is true. That is to say that gold is being moved in sort of unique ways, concentrated in secret and unique ways, and capitals are slowly but surely but methodically divesting themselves of U.S. treasuries. That Beijing and Moscow are both complicit in this, and that what they're trying to do is weaken the dollar. So what you see right now in the supposed strengthening of the dollar is really a false impression. What they want to do is what we did essentially when we abandoned the gold standard, and then oil really became the standard, because oil is demarcated and sold in dollars principally. What they want to do is use Putin and others' oil power, petrodollars if you will, and I say that petro-yuan, petro-renminbi, petro-euro, whatever, to force the United States to lose its incredibly powerful role as owning the world's transactional action reserve currency. If that happens, a similar thing will happen to what Dwight Eisenhower threatened the British with in the IMF when they invaded Suez with the French and the Israelis. The real powerful move that Ike made was to threaten to run on the pound. Eden had to back off. He had to back off. He couldn't take that. So what we're looking at is a possible use by others in the world of our dependence on the dollar to give us so much power that we otherwise wouldn't have. Charles de Gaulle once said it was vicious what we did after the war when we had the world's currency, and take that power away from us. And the debt increases enormously the capability to do that. And the debt is staggering, if you think about it. If you just look at it and you understand what the Fed's been doing in terms of quantitative easing and just printing more and more money, the only reason you do that is because you own the world's transactional currency. You can print money and money and money, and you don't do what Mobutu did, for example, drive inflation up to 300,000%. Or for example, what the Germans had happen to them in the 30s, where they, the old adage of pushing a wheelbarrow full of marks in order to buy a loaf of bread. Could it get that bad in the empire? Yes, it could, especially if the rest of the world decides that that's a good thing to do and to go along with it, or decides it has to do it. It has to use euros or...
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are doing super great from wherever you're watching us from. Now, a couple of things that are interesting that Dr. Wilkerson talked about that I feel like it's important for us to, get to memorize or remind ourselves a couple of things that he shared. Of course, these are things that we are seeing that are happening even today in the United States. And first of all, Wilkerson emphasizes that empires historically collapse not because of they are defeated in a war, but because they rot from inside out. Like Rome or Britain before, America's decline is marked by moral exhaustion, economic disparity, and political dysfunction. In pursuit of global dominance, the U.S. has abandoned the civic virtues and republican principles that once defined its identity. By militarizing foreign policy, neglecting the needs of its own population, and allowing a small elite to accumulate disproportionate wealth and power, America has systematically weakened itself from inside. And that's, I think, a couple of things that I was trying to emphasize on the introductory part. It is not merely like things that are happened outside. These are things that are manufactured inside the United States. Also, another important thing that he also talks about is one of the most powerful themes in Wilkerson's critique is the idea of militarized imperialism. Now listen to this. He argues that the United States has become addicted to war, not for defense, but as a tool of hegemony. From Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan, the military-industrial complex has pushed endless interventions under the pretext of spreading democracy or protecting freedom. These wars are often initiated without clear objectives or exit strategies, drain trillions from the national budget while creating chaos abroad. Right. Now, Wilkerson believes that America's military-first approach has made diplomacy weak. Democracy hollow, and the global perception of the U.S. is increasingly cynical. Look at it economically also. Economically, Dr. Wilkerson draws attention to America's transformation into an oligarchy. Like many fallen empires, the U.S. has seen its wealth and power concentrated in the hands of the few. We call them the top 1%, while the majority struggle with stagnant wages, declined public services, and rising debts. The offshoring of industry, the erosion of unions, and the commodification of education are all examples of policy choices that favor capital over citizens. Rather than investing in infrastructure, healthcare, or the environment, America's elite has poured resources into speculative finance and military contracts. Now you get to understand that this disinvestment is self-destructive and symptomatic of imperial hubris. Also, another thing that you need to think about this is he also addresses the collapse of political integrity. Right. He argues that both major political parties have become beholden to corporate interest, eroding public trust and turning governance into transactional game. Now, lobbyists write laws, billionaires fund campaigns, and media outlets distract the population with culture wars instead of class analysis. As democratic norms weaken, authoritarian tendencies rise. In Wilkerson's view, America has undermined its own democracy through legalized corruption, gerrymandering, voter suppression, and refusal to confront systemic inequalities. Culturally, Wilkerson observes a society drifting in consumerism and disinformation. The American public, he argues, has been depoliticized and demoralized by a culture of endless entertainment, corporate propaganda, and misinformation. This culture decay serves empire by producing passive citizens who no longer question authority or demand justice, rather than encouraging critical thought and civic participation. The system rewards distraction, division, and apathy. This is not failure of the people alone. It's a strategic income. It's a strategic outcome of an empire's decline. One thing that you need to note is that in discussing America's moral contradictions, Wilkerson's emphasis how the country's foreign and domestic policies are deeply misaligned with its stated values. While the U.S. claims to uphold liberty and human rights, it supports authoritarian regimes abroad and tolerate mass incarceration, racial injustice, and poverty at home. These contradictions weakens Americans' credibility on the world stage and reveal a profound spiritual crisis within the nation. Empires fall not only because they lose power, but because they lose purpose. And America's ethical confusion is a glaring sign of that loss. Now, Wilkerson also critiques America's exemptionalism narrative, which he sees as a dangerous myth that blinds the nation to its own failures. The belief that America is uniquely virtuous or destined to lead the world prevents critical assessment. Remember, it encourages arrogance rather than humility, domination rather than cooperation. This mythology has allowed the country to justify war, neglect reform, and ignore the lessons of history. According to Wilkerson, real patriotism requires truth-telling, not blind allegiance to an idealized image of the nation. Also, one of the most urgent warnings Wilkerson delivers is about the threat of climate change and environmental collapse, which the U.S. has largely ignored due to corporate lobbying and political inertia. Just as ancient empires collapsed due to ecological depletion, America's refusal to take environmental stewardship seriously may be one of its gravest self-inflicted wounds. The prioritization of profit over planetary survival is not just short-sighted. It is suicidal for an empire that claims to lead the world into the future. I'd like to conclude by saying that Professor Wilkerson's travails of empire, this is a profound diagnosis of America's decline, rooted not in conspiracy or ideology, but in historical patterns and structural realities. The United States, he argues, is not destroyed by China, Russia, or terrorism. It is collapsing under the weight of its own contradiction through fast militarism, inequality, corruption, and denial. It has created the very conditions for its undoing. Yet, Wilkerson leaves room for hope. Decline is not destiny, but to reverse the fall, America must confront its imperial identity, rebuild its civic institutions, and recommit to the democratic values it once espoused, not merely in rhetoric, but in practice. I'm your host and presenter, Eugene Stories. But until then, I'm hoping to see you in my next video. Just a reminder, for those who are watching us for the first time, again, I'll remind you to please subscribe the channel. I'm on my way to 150k subs. You want to be part of that because I'll be bringing you content that we can discuss all these issues at the same time, learn from each other. Right? For those who are supporting us through my Cash App, for those who are supporting us through my Super Thanks, I'm highly grateful for the support that you're giving me. But until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.